Today we're going to do a class on the Hora Varga, which is the second divisional chart. And this is a chart that's really overlooked in general. Everyone uses the Navamsha. Some people use the Dasamsha, Dwadasamsha for parents, a few other ones. But one of the ones you rarely see being used is the Hora Varga. And after you get done with this, multi-video class on the Hora, you're going to be surprised that no one doesn't use it every time, because it's just a wealth of information that you can only get from the Hora chart. It's really a critical Varga. You're going to be using it every time after this course, I bet. Okay, you're going to look at it all the time, because there's just so many great things about it. So first, what is Hora for? Well, first of all, it's the Hora chart. Hora means hour. And the reason it's called hour is because there's 12 signs in the zodiac. It takes 24 hours for all 12 signs to rise. And a Hora is half a sign. So it takes approximately 1 hour on the average for one Hora to rise. Okay? At the equator. North or south of the equator, some will be a little longer and some will be a little shorter. That's why this is simply called the Hora Varga, instead of calling it the second Varga, or something like that, that it has sort of a special name. Now, Parashar tells us that the Hora Varga is to be looked at for Sampat. And another book which has some good stuff on Vargas is called Sanketi Nidhi, and it says all about wealth and happiness should be examined from Hora. So, he says wealth and happiness, and the key addition to that sutra is he says happiness, whereas Parashar just says Sampat. Now, Sampat is a word that has a lot of meaning. Okay? Usually people just translate it as wealth, but it's really not wealth. It doesn't translate into wealth. What is wealth? Wealth is money in the bank, right? Wealth is, money, basically. Okay? Or property and things that can be easily turned into money. But Sampat is really not that. Sampat is prosperity. That's probably the single best word to use to define it. It can mean prosperity, success, accomplishment, but really prosperity is probably the best English word for it. What is prosperity? Well, prosperity is just not having money. Okay? In fact, when you watch Star Trek and Spock says goodbye, he goes, live long and prosper, right? And when you get him, when he says that, you get the feeling he doesn't just mean get lots of money. He means to prosper, to really have somehow a worthwhile life. Okay, something more than that. So prosperity is not just wealth. How one guru defined it is prosperity is getting the ability to get what you need when you need it. Okay, that's really true prosperity, right? So a prosperous person, if he's living in the city and he needs to make rent, he manages and gets the money to make rent. But if he's in the jungle and needs to find food, he has the prosperity to find food and shelter, whatever he needs. If he's ill, he has the prosperity to find a cure. So really prosperity is that ability to get what we need to manage our lives. And it's much, much more important than wealth. Okay? And to prosper also means to have a feeling of satisfaction about your life. How many people have so much in their lives, but not a lot of satisfaction with what they have? They're married, they're not satisfied with marriage. They have a job, they're not satisfied at work. They have children, they're not satisfied with children, whatever. Well, satisfaction comes into this prosperity. Okay? So prosperity is the ability to have what we need and get what we need when we need it, and to have a feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction with what we have in our lives. So that we feel like basically life is worth living. And that's what it really comes down to. Life, is it worth living? And the second chart in the second house in the horoscope is the house that the Hora is the chart for, right? And of course the second house has to do with our value, our sense of worth and value. So of course the Hora has inclinations of our sense of worth and value. Do we find life worthwhile with what we have? To see all those things, we have to look at that Hora chart. And that's why Sanketi Nidhi says happiness. Because that's a big part of our happiness. It's just feeling like what we have in our life is worthwhile. Okay, that we're living a worthwhile life. If not, you don't want it. If you have all the great things in your life, you don't feel it's worthwhile, then you may not even want to live anymore. And you'll see as we go on how the Hora chart really shows with the things that we have, are we really finding worth in those things, or do those things somehow feel stifling? So the Hora chart's a really, really important chart to look at anytime we're dealing with the character or psychology, the level of happiness of the person. Okay? And that's really no surprise when you consider the deities of the Horas, which are the sun and moon. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about those in a little bit here. Okay, and another thing I wanted to mention about the Hora, it has a lot to do with, the prosperity to fulfill our responsibilities. It's not the prosperity to get what we want. That's more like money wealth. It's the ability to fulfill our responsibilities and to find satisfaction and meaning in those and taking care of those responsibilities. So the Hora is a heavy chart. It's a chart of responsibilities and whether we're happy or unhappy with those responsibilities that we have. Now the Hora chart is calculated really easily. Each sign is divided into half. Okay. So that gives us 24 Horas, with each sign divided in half. Okay? Now, most people just use the deities, okay, which are the sun and the moon. And they'll give the first half of Aries to the sun, the second half to the moon, the first half of Taurus to the moon, the second half to the sun, the first half of Gemini to the sun, the second half to the moon. Then the first half of Cancer, let me write that a little better, is moon, second half is sun. Then the first half of Leo is sun, second half is moon. First half of Virgo is moon, second half of Virgo is sun. So basically, the first half of an odd sign, Aries, Gemini, Leo, Libra, and so on, is ruled by the sun, has the deity of the sun. And the second half of an odd sign is ruled by the moon. And in the even signs, it's reversed, with the first half of an even sign, such as Taurus and Cancer and Virgo, ruled by the moon, and the second half being ruled by the sun. Okay? Now that's the deities. On lots of software, you might look at a Hora chart, and it's going to look like this. You'll have this chart, and all the planets will be in Cancer, and Leo. All 7 planets, and the ascendant, they're all being Cancer and Leo. They're really not, okay? What those charts are telling you is that they're ruled by the sun deity or the sun deity or the moon deity. But that's not the Hora chart. We actually have to calculate out a Hora chart, an actual chart that has all 12 signs. Otherwise, it's not a chart. Now, in most of the sutras that talk about the Horas just want to know, is the planet in the Hora of the sun or is the planet in the Hora of the moon? They don't get into using the Hora chart itself as a full chart. But that's typical of the old books. None of the old books get into using any of the Varga charts as a whole chart. Okay? So why should they get into it as a Hora? But that doesn't mean the Hora doesn't exist as a complete chart. So the first thing we really have to do is calculate the chart. Okay? Now, Parashara gives us the best and most important information on the Hora. He says sun, moon, and odd rashis, and even reversed. So that's the deities. The sun and the moon are the deities of the Hora Varga. Every Varga is going to have deities attached to it. All of them. Even the Shashtiamsha, which has 60 deities attached to it. The Hora chart, because it's a Varga of just 2, has 2 deities, the sun and moon. Then he says, ancestors are the lords of the moon's Hora, devas of the suns, it is said. So then he goes on to say that devas are related to the sun Hora, and ancestors, or pitrus, which means forefathers or ancestors, are ruled by the moon's Hora, or are related to the moon's Hora. So those are some further deities. Now this is the important thing. Thus it is known that 24 half rashis create the Horas. Beginning from Aries, these Horas revolve twice. So he's saying, beginning from Aries, these Horas revolve twice. And there's 24 of them. Now that sutra by itself might not sound like a lot. Beginning from Aries, the Horas revolve twice. What does that mean? Okay. Well, that means this. Aries rules the first half of the Hora of Aries. Taurus rules the first half of Taurus. Gemini rules the second half of Gemini. Cancer rules the first half of Cancer. Leo rules the first half of Leo. Virgo rules the first half of Virgo. And on all the rest of the halves, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. So we've gone around the whole zodiac. Okay? Then the next question is, what's the next thing we do? Now that we've gone around the whole zodiac, and we get to Aries again, do we start at Aries again? No. Now we start at the sign opposite Aries, which is Libra. The second half of Aries, the Hora, is Libra. The second half of Scorpio, or Taurus, is Scorpio. Second half of Gemini is Sag. Second half of Cancer is Capricorn, and so on. Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. So the second half of the sign is ruled by the sign opposite the sign. Okay, so for Taurus, the second half is Scorpio, the sign opposite it. So it has a 1-7 relationship. And that's the way to calculate out the Hora chart. That's what he means when he says, beginning from Aries, these Horas revolve twice. Now, why do we know he means that? Well, because in the Dracana chart, I'll take Dracana here for a minute. Dracana chart, he gets more specific with the divisions. He says the first third of the sign, because we're dealing with thirds now, is ruled by the sign itself. So the first half of Aries is Aries. The second half third of the sign is ruled by the fifth from there. The fifth from Aries is Leo. And the third part of the sign is ruled from the ninth from there, which would be Sag. So in the Dracana, what Parashar does, he goes 1, 5, 9. So 1, 5, 9 for the thirds of the Dracana. The reason he does that is because whenever there's a Varga that can be divided into the number 12, like 2 can divide into 12, 3 can divide into 12, 4 can divide into 12. Those are the 4 Vargas he has that can divide into 12. He always uses this formula of going that division. So going 1/3, another third, and the last third. And in that sutra with the Dracana, he specifically says the first part is Aries, the second part is Leo, and the third part is Sag. And then he says, that is known that 36, Rashis create the Dracanas. Beginning from Aries, these Dracanas revolve 3 times. So he uses the very same process as he does for the Hora chart. So that lets us know for the Hora chart, we have to go halfway for the second half. Okay? So that's how we know that's the way to calculate the Hora chart. Because there is another possibility. Okay? The other possibility of calculating the Hora chart is to do this. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. Then start at Aries again. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. And basically go around the zodiac using 2 zodiacs. Okay? And that method is a valid method. That concept of calculating Varga charts is what's used in Tajika system. That concept is what's used in the Trim Samsha. That concept is used in the Saptamsha. That concept is used in the Navamsha. Parashara uses that same concept. But in Vargas that are divided into 12, like Hora, 2 divided into 12 is 6, or Dracana, 3 divided into 12, or Chaturtamsha, 4 divides into 12 3 times. In the Vargas that divide into 12, he follows the method of going for the Dracana 1/3 of the way, 2/3 of the way. For the Hora going halfway. For the Chaturtamsha going 1/4 of the way, 2/4, 3/4, and back to the beginning. So, for some reason, he doesn't follow the same system of calculating a divisional chart. It seems the preferred way is to go halfway around the zodiac for the second half, or a third of the way through the zodiac for the second third in the Dracana, and so on. Then he does to just go Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, and go around in the normal order. Why he does that is hard to say, okay, when some other systems do it otherwise. So if we have to follow his precedent that he sets in the Dracana chart, then we need to calculate the Hora out. Aries, Libra, Taurus, Scorpio, Gemini, Sag. Okay, that follows the system he sets out in the Dracana with the very same wording. Okay, and originally I tried the Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo method, and found that the Aries, Libra, Taurus, Scorpio method works better. Okay, so that's the method we'll be using. So we actually calculate a full Hora chart. So you'll see a real chart with all the planets and any sign that they want to be in, not just limited to Cancer and Leo. Okay, so you have basically three things going on with the Hora. You have a planets in a sign in the Rashi, and then it's going to be in a different sign possibly in the Hora chart, or half the time it'll be the same sign. Then the planet will be in the Hora of the Sun or the Moon, and then the planet will be ruled by the Devas or the Pitris, the Devas or the ancestors. So there's a lot of information you can get from the Hora chart. And how do we know this information is important? Well, because the Horas are of the Sun and the Moon, the two big important planets in Vedic astrology. In any system of astrology, the Sun and Moon are the most important guys up in the sky, right? So the Varga chart, where the Sun and the Moon are the lords, just has to be important, doesn't it? Okay, the other Varga chart that has planetary lords is the Trim Samsha. And that's a very important chart as well, for the very same reason, because the lords are planets. And in astrology, don't you think the Vargas that have planetary lords are going to be like really critical? Okay, seems pretty simple. Yet so many people don't calculate out a full Hora chart. They just look at the Hora, the Sun and Moon, if that even. So that's how we calculate the chart. On the page of your handout, there's a little breakdown of, each half of the signs, Aries through Pisces, with the sign that is in the Hora, and whether the Sun or Moon rules it. Okay. Now there's another system that you might come across for calculating Horas, and this is that Brihad Jataka says this. Some astrologers take the first half of a Rashi under its own lord, and the second half of that Rashi under the lord of the 11th house from the Rashi. So for Aries, for instance, the first half is Aries. Or, sorry, not Aries. The first house is the lord of the house, which is Mars. Mars rules the first half of Aries. And the second half of Aries is ruled by the lord of Aquarius, which is Saturn. Okay? Now that's another way that people divide the sign. But that's not a division into a chart. That's a division of finding a meaningful lord over that half of a sign. It has nothing to do with the Hora chart. Okay? Yet some people calculate it as a Hora chart. And in that same token, Venus would rule the first half of Taurus, and the 11th lord from Taurus would rule the second half. So Jupiter would rule the second half of Taurus. That's not for making a chart. That doesn't mean that if we have Mars in the second half of Taurus, it goes into Pisces in the Hora chart. It's not what it means, though some people are doing that. What it means is simply that Venus rules the first half of Taurus, and the 11th house of Taurus is ruled by Jupiter, the 11th from there. Second half is ruled by Jupiter, the 11th from Taurus. That's an actual technique. It's not a Varga. It's a technique. And in that technique, what it is that the first half of the sign is the actions we take to make that sign happen. The second half of the sign is the gains we get from that action. And gains, we know, are the 11th from anything. So the gains of Taurus are going to be dependent upon Pisces or Jupiter to some degree. So if Jupiter's in good shape, the gains from Taurus are going to be greater. Okay? And that's a technique that you can use. Maybe at some point we'll actually get into it. They do something similar with the Drekina, okay? But that's not a technique we're going to deal with in this course because it has nothing to do with Vargas. It's a Rashi-centered technique. It's not a Varga technique. It's not for calculating out Vargas, okay? But I wanted to make mention of that method that some people use to try to calculate a Hora chart because it's out there. And that method is from Yavana Jataka, which is a great textbook on astrology, okay? Okay, so the important thing about the Hora, and really the most fun thing about it, are the deities, the sun and the moon. First half of odd signs ruled by the sun, and the second half of even signs is ruled by the sun. Then the second half of odd signs and the first half of even signs is ruled by the moon. And this divides the chart into masculine and feminine polarities, right? Sun is fully male, moon is fully female. Sun is initiative and intelligent. The moon is receptive and all-knowing, intuitively knowing. So these are the two opposing forces within us. And anyone who's studied yoga knows how important those two forces are, the lunar current, or the solar current and the lunar current, right? The sun is the right side of the body, the moon is the left side of the body. So one of the things we use these Hora lords for is for seeing the right and left sides of the body. Blockages in the right side of the body and problems to the right side of the body will happen when planets are in the Hora of the sun. Blockages and problems with the left side of the body happen to are caused by planets that fall in the Hora of the moon, because the moon's half is the left side. Okay? Problems with activity are indicated by the sun's Hora, or lack of planets in the sun Hora, and problems with receptivity can be indicated by planets in the Hora of the moon. So you really want to study your sun and moon. Brihad Parashara gives a really good description of the sun and moon in his book, which is, 4 or 5 sutras for each planet. And if you get Graha Sutras out and read that description, I've expanded on it and talked a lot about these masculine and feminine qualities of the sun and moon. And those qualities are fully applicable to planets falling in the Hora of the sun or moon. Okay? So, we have, action and receptivity. That's the basic thing, the male and the female. So everything you know about the male and female, you want to apply to when you use the Hora chart. If you have a planet in the sun's Hora, that planet is going to be a male energized planet. The question is, will it be happy as a male energized planet? And if you have a planet in the Hora of the moon, it's going to be a female energized planet. The question is, will it be happy as a female energized planet? But that's what you're really looking at when you look at the Hora. Is it male energized, active, initiative energized, or is it female energized, receptively centered? Okay? And you can guess how important that is, right? Okay. So when we look at the Hora chart, there's 2 aspects to it. One thing is we read the chart and we make predictions for the person's prosperity, the person's ability to manage their resources, the person's ability to cover their expenses and meet their needs and meet the needs of their loved ones and the people they care for. Okay? And we just read it as a chart, exactly the way we learn to read planets and bhavas in the Judging Bhavas course and in the Lajitati Bhavas course. We just read it that way. And we see what they're getting in life. Okay? That's just normal technique of astrology. Whatever predictive principles you use in the Hora chart to see what that Hora chart is giving in the context of prosperity, that's what you use. Along with that, there's a whole dynamic of things that are happening based on the deities, though, which is often ignored. So like with anything, there's making the prediction, and then there's seeing what's underneath that. And it's the deities that show what's underneath that. And what are deities? Deities are the conscious or subconscious forces that are bringing about the events. Okay? Basically, they're the forces in our consciousness that are making things happen. If the forces in our consciousness are making things happen in a way that follows natural laws, then we find happiness and satisfaction. But if the forces in our consciousness are making things happen in ways that are against natural laws, then we're not happy, we're miserable. Okay? And that's what the sun and moon's Hora will tell us. Okay? So, Hora again comes to the rescue to help us see how to figure that out. He says, the sun's Hora fructifies Jupiter, Sun, and Mars. The moon, Venus, and Saturn are granted fruit by the moon's Hora. Both fructify Mercury, and even the moon and the other the sun fructifies. So the sun's Hora fructifies Jupiter, the sun, and Mars. Those are the three male planets. Makes sense. They're going to fructify when they're masculine geared, when they're geared towards the energy of the sun. The moon, Venus, and Saturn fructify in the Hora of the moon. Well, the moon and Venus make sense because they're female planets. So obviously you want those female planets to be femininely charged by being in the Hora of the moon. But how does Saturn fall in there? Well, Saturn is a neuter. He's not male, he's not female. But Saturn is a planet that needs validation for himself, not what he does. And so that makes him find greater happiness in the Hora of the moon. A planet like Mars, for instance, he doesn't want to be validated for who he is. He wants to be validated for what he does. Okay? So he's like the hero that doesn't care what people think about him. He feels validated because he saves the day. Saturn, on the other hand, is the servant who's doing hard work and labor and cleaning. And he doesn't want to be validated for doing a great job cleaning up the house. He wants to be validated for who he is. That he's a worthwhile person to know and love and be around. So that's a feminine quality. Wanting to be validated for who you are is feminine. So Saturn likes the Hora of the moon. Wanting to be respected for what you do is the Hora is a masculine quality, and therefore these planets fall into the Hora, like the Hora of the sun better. So that's why this neuter planet gets away wanting to be in the Hora of the moon. Okay. Then Mercury, the final planet, Mercury can do good in either the Hora of the sun or the Hora of the moon. Okay? If Mercury's in a male sign, then he likes the Hora of the sun. Because in a male sign, he's going to take on a more masculine nature. Male signs are Aries, Gemini, Leo, and so on. However, if Mercury's in a female sign, such as Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, and so on, then he's going to feel happier if he's in the Hora of the moon. Mercury always has an adjustable nature. He can go either way. He's going to be sort of geared in the direction of the sign he's in. Basically, the sign that a planet's in, whether it's male or female, puts that sign on a masculine or feminine path, meaning a path where that planet's going to have to operate as male or female. If you have a planet in a female sign, it's going to have to operate more in a feminine way to get down the road of life. But if it's in the Hora of the sun, at the core of it, it's still a masculine-centered planet. Okay? So Mercury is adjustable. If he's in a male sign, he totally becomes male in how he has to approach his life. So then we want him in the Hora of the sun. However, if he's in a female sign, he's very feminine towards his approach to life, and then he wants to be in the Hora of the moon in order to find satisfaction. Okay? So, when you get male planets, or Mercury in a male sign, in the sun's Hora, those planets can be satisfied with their responsibilities in life and the things they have to do in life. And when you get the female planets, Moon, Venus, and also the neuter Saturn, or Mercury when it's in a female sign, in the Hora of the moon, then those planets have the capacity to feel satisfied with what life gives to them. Okay? If it's reversed, if you have male signs, or Mercury in a male sign, male planets or Mercury in a male sign in the Hora of the moon, or Moon, Venus, and Saturn in the Hora of the sun, or Mercury in a female sign and in the Hora of the sun, then you have the opposite. Then you have a planet that can't find satisfaction, and you have an unhappy planet. Okay? And it's a terrible feeling to have responsibilities in life, to have things in life, yet not be satisfied with those things. And that's why Sanketi Nidhi says, this chart has a lot to do with happiness. And this is how we tell the happiness. Real quickly, you just look and see if the planets are in the appropriate horas. If they are, those planets have a greater capacity for feeling satisfaction with whatever they have in life. Where if it's opposite, even if those planets are giving a lot because they're in good dignity, they have aspects of friends, and the Hora chart has, planets aspecting the Bhavas, and those planets are in good dignities, and it's giving a lot of good fruits. Well, even then, if they're opposite, the person doesn't have the capacity to feel satisfied with those things. Okay? And that's one of the key things we look at in the Hora chart, just how satisfied is this person with what they have in life. Okay? So, when we look at the Hora chart as a chart, we have to read it in a predictive sense to see, is it giving productivity or not? But even after it's giving productivity, we start to see, will the person be satisfied with that productivity? And to determine that, we have to look, see if the planets are in the appropriate horas. And that's an important thing. Okay? Now, interesting enough, most astrologers who divide the chart into just Cancer and Leo, when they try to figure out a good Varga, they'll want Jupiter, for instance, to be in the Hora of the Moon. And they'll say, oh, it's exalted, it's in the Hora of the Moon. And when they calculate Shad Bala, Jupiter in the Hora of the Moon is going to be exalted, no matter what sign it actually falls in the Hora. Not the right way to do it. You have to calculate a true Hora chart with 12 signs in it to find the dignities of the planets for Shad Bala. The deities is a separate matter. It's separate from the Rashis. It's a separate consideration. Now, in the sutra I just read to you, the end of it says, both fructify Mercury, and even the moon and the other the sun fructifies. Most people translate that sutra to say, male planets and male signs in the sun's Hora are good, and female planets and Saturn in female signs and the moon's Hora is good, and Mercury is good no matter where he is. That's not quite right. Male planets and female signs, as long as they're in the Hora of the sun, can be good. So they won't be quite as powerful as being if they're male signs. And female planets and odd signs in the Hora of the moon can be fine. They can be very satisfying. But it's Mercury whose happiness depends on male or female signs, not the other planets. That last part of the sutra only applies to the planet Mercury, who if in a male sign wants the sun's Hora, and in a female sign wants the moon Hora. That part of the sutra only belongs to Mercury. Okay? So you might, in Parashara, the translator writes it differently. He puts the last part of the sutra, he puts the last part of the second sutra into sort of the beginning of the first sutra, which is just not right. It's one thing to move words around in a sutra, but you don't go to a second sutra and take something from the end of that and put it in the beginning of the first sutra. That's just not a proper way to read Sanskrit. One sutra at a time, and within that, words can have funny orders, because that's the nature of Sanskrit, but you don't bring up something from another order in another sutra and put it in the beginning of another sutra. We've got two totally different concepts with this, and the second concept in the second sutra is Mercury in a male sign or female sign will be happy in the sun or moon's Hora. Okay. So that's the Hora of the sun and moon, the masculine and feminine. Now, Parashara adds a little bit more so we can understand the Hora a little bit better. And so we can understand the Hora of the sun and moon a little bit better. And that is, he gives, the sun's Hora are Devas. These are ruled by the Devas. And the moon Hora is ruled by the Pitrus, which are the ancestors. Okay? So a planet's going to be related to the Devas or the ancestors. So what does that mean exactly? Well, all the things that happen in life, all the karmas we read are the result, not, we can say all of them, but they're the result of our ancestors or ourselves. And to say they're a result of ourselves means ultimately that they're the result of the devas, that God's wishes for us. Okay? Because the gods are the sole causative force. So the first time we were born, what happened to us was dependent upon the gods, right? And from that point on, the karma of our soul manifested more and more until here we are. But also the karmas of our ancestors influence us. We can, 7 generations back, the things our ancestors have done are influencing our life here, now, and today in a very, very powerful way. That's why in lots of parts of Asia, there's a tendency to worship and appease one's ancestors and to do spiritual rites for their ancestors, because they recognize the impact those ancestors' actions have had on our current life. Okay? Scientifically speaking, we would say the DNA of your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother has a huge impact on who you are today. That's true, right? Okay. And in, Asian idea, it goes back 7 generations. And likewise, anything you do is going to affect your generations for 7 generations after you. Okay? So, the karmas we're reaping are due to the devas or the pitrus. And if a planet falls in the Hora of the sun, it's due to the devas. If it falls in the Hora of the moon, it's due to the ancestor. Okay? Now, the karmas of the ancestors are things that are more personal. Because these are your ancestors, right? These are your family. They're more close. And therefore, the Hora of the moon is a more enjoyable Hora for family life, for social living, for building a good family, having a nice, warm, loving lifestyle. The Hora of the moon is better for that. Because of that reason, lots of the old texts give good results to plants in the Hora of the moon and bad results to plants in the Hora of the sun. Okay, because so much of Indian culture revolves around having that sweet family life, that loving, nurturing family life where everything a person does has to do with the family. And when plants are in the Hora of the moon, those plants do become more family-centered. Although that doesn't always mean those plants are going to be happy there, as we're going to find out. Okay? When plants are in the Hora of the sun, then the karmas are due to the devas or oneself. There's a stronger sense of individuality there. There's a stronger sense of self-sacrifice there. Okay? Because it's the sun that makes sacrifices to its personal happiness for the greater happiness. That's the nature of the sun. The sun finds happiness in giving and doing above and beyond himself. Whereas the moon, however, doesn't. The moon is lovesick. The moon feels good when it's loved and nurtured, and also when it gives love and nurturing as a result of the love and nurturing it has received to begin with. So the moon is happy when it gives money because it just got $100, so it's happy to give away 90 to a loved one. Okay? But the sun is like, I don't have $100. You need $100. Let me go figure out a way to get the $100 for you. And so he sacrifices his time and energy to create that $100 to give to somebody. Okay? So, the sun has more of a spirit of sacrifice, where the moon has more of a spirit of family, we could say. Okay? And of course, the moon rules our family. Okay? So, we have responsibilities due to the karmas of our ancestors, or we have responsibilities due to karmas of the devas. The responsibilities that the devas give us are those responsibilities we have towards the world and our fellow man. All of us being born here have a responsibility towards the world. Some. How much? Well, it depends how many plants are in the Hora of the sun. If plants are in the Hora of the sun, we have responsibilities towards the world with those planets. And that means impersonal responsibilities. Okay? And responsibilities that will require an element of self-sacrifice. Okay? Or an element of sacrifice. Planets in the Hora of the moon, however, those have to do with family responsibilities and ancestral responsibilities. Those are more personal responsibilities, where the satisfaction comes from the warmth and nurturing that's created in the family environment. Okay? So we have these two types of responsibilities. Some people have more of one kind than another kind. And some planets prefer different types of responsibilities. Jupiter, Sun, Mars, and Mercury in a male sign, they prefer the responsibility of the impersonal responsibility towards the world. Okay, they find satisfaction, these planets, when they're giving to the world. Okay, however, and so when they're in the Hora of the Sun, they can very effectively fulfill that responsibility in a way that's satisfying. But if this Jupiter, Mars, Sun, or Mercury in the male signs in the Hora of the Moon, then that planet, which has a desire to, give to the world because it's nature, has family karmas that stifle it from doing that, and instead it finds itself wrapped up in familial things and familial responsibilities and responsibilities due to its ancestors that don't let it really become the thing it really wants to become in the world. And so then these planets, when they're Hora of the Moon, are going to find, or won't find satisfaction in the responsibilities that they give us. Okay? Now, the female planets in Saturn and Mercury, when it's in a female sign, they find satisfaction in ancestral and family karmas. Okay? When they're in the Hora of the Moon, they can build and grow those things in a way that's enriching and rewarding to their lives. If they're in the Hora and the Sun, they don't feel that. Okay? They're not personally attuned enough to find satisfaction in those familial lifestyles. Okay? Instead, they make a sacrifice of themselves because they're in the Hora of the Sun. But these planets don't find satisfaction in making a sacrifice. Only the male planets do, not the female planets and not Saturn. So these planets are going to be unhappy in the Hora of the Sun, because then they're inclined to fulfill, they're designed, we can say, and inclined to fulfill ancestral karmas, but instead they're in the Hora of the Sun, so they are instead fulfilling impersonal karmas towards the world, which is not where they want to be. Okay, and then they won't be satisfied. Sometimes, so when a person comes to you and says, what should I focus on in life? Find the planet that's in a good Hora. If it's one of these planets in a male in the Sun's Hora, or one of these in the Moon's Hora, cultivating that planet is where they're going to find their satisfaction in life, where they feel the work, the effort, and the responsibility makes me feel satisfied. But the planets that are in opposite Horas, that are in contrary Horas, those planets, doesn't matter what that person has with that thing, they'll never feel really satisfied in that thing. So Venus, if a person has Venus in the Hora of the Moon, they can be very satisfied in married life. Marriage can be found as a satisfactory thing if they have the good enough stuff to have a good marriage. But if Venus is in the Hora of the Sun, marriage will always feel stifling somehow to them. They'll want to relate in a more impersonal way to the whole world, and a family and being married will somehow feel stifling to them. And so that no matter how great their family is, no matter how great their spouse is, somehow they'll feel stifled in it and they won't be completely satisfied. So you can easily tell that person, you won't have the greatest satisfaction in marriage. Don't put all your hopes for satisfaction there. Find the planet that's in the appropriate Hora. And that's the planet that the person can find the greatest satisfaction in their life. And of course, out of those planets, the one that's in the best dignity and has the best Lajitadya Vashta, that's the planet that can give the greatest prosperity and the greatest satisfaction. And that will really be, when it comes to a concrete happiness, a happiness because of something I have in my life, that will be the greatest giver of happiness in the chart. There's two kinds of happiness. There's the concrete happiness, and then there's just happiness, right? Concrete happiness is happiness with the things we have and the things we have to do. That's the Hora chart happiness. And then there's just the blissful spiritual happiness, which is different Vargas, which we'll get to, particularly the 16th Varga. But the happiness with our concrete life, our concrete responsibilities, that's the Hora chart. And that's a big part of happiness when we're down here on Earth. And the planet that's in the planets in the good Hora, in the right Horas, according to this diagram, those are the ones that have the capacity to give happiness in respect to the things they represent naturally, and in respect to the things, the bhavas, they rule in the Hora chart. Okay? So that's a very, very important thing about it, about these two planets. Okay. And we're going to go over all this stuff with lots of examples after we go through actually learning the Hora. Then we'll start reading some Horas. But first we're going to learn the basics. Okay. What bhavas do we need to study in the Hora chart? Okay. Well, you always study the Lagna, right? Because the Lagna and the Lagna Lord represents you along the path of that Varga. So the Hora Lagna Lord, I'll put the Lagna up here somewhere, represents the path to your responsibilities. Okay? The path to your concrete satisfaction. Because the Hora, again, has to do with the concrete satisfaction we get. How we are in respect to fulfilling our responsibilities and finding secure happiness and satisfaction in the concrete responsibilities that are a big part of our lives. That's the Lagna. Okay, do we bravely walk towards it? Are we timid about it? Are we shy? Are we enthusiastic? Are we lazy? That requires a study of the Lagna. Okay? So that's always an important bhava in every chart. The Lagna, that's you along the path of that thing. Okay? Now in the Hora chart, because it's Varga number 2, that means the second bhava becomes the primary bhava. The second bhava is the bhava of responsibility and the resourcefulness and resources to fulfill those responsibilities. In other words, the prosperity to take care of the things in our life. So we have to look at that second bhava. That second bhava has so much to do with how really satisfied we can be with anything. Does it feel like a burden, or does it feel like worth doing? Second house. Do we have the ability and the resources to take care of things or not? Second house. That's the primary house in the Hora chart. If that house is good, you're going to have some good stuff with your Hora chart no matter what. Okay? Now, when we add up all the numbers in 2, we get 1 plus 2 equals 3. Those in 2, we have the number 1 and the number 2. Add them up, we get 3. So, a secondary house of the Hora chart, that's important to look at, is the third bhava. The third bhava in the Hora represents the energy and courage available to the individual with which to find satisfaction and happiness. In case you haven't figured out, the Hora chart has to do with responsibilities and the element of work. It's an Artha Varga, meaning it has to do with material responsibilities. And the third bhava in that chart has to do with the energy, enthusiasm, courage that we have to approach that. So a person may not have a good second house. They may not have a good fate for their responsibilities to be easily fulfilled. But they have a good third house in the Hora chart. They're going to have all kinds of energy and enthusiasm and courage to really push things along a lot. And that third house can go a long ways in making up for a bad second house. Furthermore, the third house is the second house from the second, right? So here's the third house, the second from the second, 1, 2. So it has, third house has always had second house connotation. Okay? Then the other important bhava, we square the number 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. And that means the fourth house is important. Remember? That's the house of happiness. And Sankati Nidhi said, look at the Hora chart for happiness. So, the squared house always has to do with the results. The results of fulfilling our responsibilities, second house, having prosperity, is happiness, right? Or the result of having wealth and resources is house, right? The first thing you buy as an extension of taking care of your family is a house. Fourth house things. So the fourth bhava in the Hora represents the happiness derived from one's concrete success and accomplishments, as well as the possible property owned as an article of wealth and prosperity. So the fourth house is the result of the Hora, sort of what you're looking for. You're looking for a safe, secure place, and you're looking for happiness as a result of fulfilling all those responsibilities. We're not taking on all the responsibilities, whether responsibilities given by the Devas to serve the world, or the responsibilities given to us by our ancestors to serve our family so we can be miserable. We want to do all that and find happiness in it. For that, we look at the fourth bhava. So even if the second and third bhavas are weak and difficult, and it's a constant struggle, a person can still find happiness in all that if the fourth bhava and fourth lord in the Hora chart are in good shape. So we got three important bhavas to look at in this chart, plus the lagna as usual. And then for the capacity for satisfaction, we have to look at the horas of the sun and moon, and if the planets are in the hora of the sun or moon. Okay? That the right planets are in the right hora. Now, every Varga has an important planet. For the Rashi chart, Varga number 1, the important planet was the sun. For the Hora chart, Varga number 2, the important planet is the moon. So you always want to examine the condition of the moon in the Hora chart, because the moon represents our full capacity for feeling satisfied with anything. An afflicted moon is someone who's never satisfied, right? A beautiful moon is someone who's easily satisfied and content. And what is a non-satisfied person? It's a person who never feels like they have enough, meaning a person who never feels prosperous. Whereas a satisfied person is someone who feels happy with what they have, meaning they feel prosperous. So in the Hora chart, the moon is the most important planet to look at in respect to afflictions to it, conjunctions with bad planets, and so on. Being in difficult houses, being in a bad dignity, and so on. We want a good moon in the Hora chart, ideally. That'll go a long ways in a person feeling satisfied with their responsibilities in life and peacefully going about fulfilling their duties. An afflicted moon in the Hora is someone who's constantly irritated by their responsibilities, constantly unsatisfied with what they have to do, and constantly feeling burdened. Okay? So those are the important things we have to look at in the Hora chart. And that is going to be it for this video. We are going to have a lot more videos culminating in looking at charts with all these principles being used to analyze the Hora chart. But I'm sure just from this first class you can get the idea that you just want to go look at the Hora now and say, gosh, is this person going to be satisfied in this? You know, you can start doing it already. We'll learn more and we'll get better at doing it. But you can see how there's so many things that you've always wanted to know that you've been doing with the Rashi chart that are going to be a lot easier and quicker to do with the Hora chart, because we have those two important deities, the sun and moon, to help us see if the planets have the capacity for satisfaction or not. Okay?